Welcome to Another Education is Possible, a podcast that explores education's radical potential. I'm your host, Samantha Hoelhe.
And I'm your host, Bosco.
Disability is oftentimes seen as a taboo topic. Ableist notions of normality dominate society and culture, marking people with disabilities as deviant and excluding them from everyday life, politics, and education.
In this episode, we speak with Dr. Susan Baglieri, a former high school special education teacher and current professor in the Department of Teaching and Learning at Montclair State University.
Our conversation reflects on special education classrooms and schooling.
Namely, we challenge traditional segregationist models of teaching,
Interrogate the collective work that needs to be done to provide students with autonomy,
and reflect on the importance of interdependence. Without further ado, let's listen to our conversation with Dr. Baglieri. Welcome back, everybody, to Another Education is Possible. How are you doing, Sue?
I'm great, Bosco. Thank you so much for having me. I want to tell you first off that I am a fan of your podcast. I'm not going to lie and say that I knew about it before your professor reached out, but once I did, I've been listening to every episode, past and present. So thank you so much for inviting me. It's really cool to be a part of it.
Thank you. That's great to hear. So, to start, could you tell us a bit about yourself and how you began your career in education?
Sure, yeah. So I started my career in the most traditional way possible. I studied to be a special education teacher as an undergraduate student in Northeast New Jersey at William Patterson, and I started teaching literally the day after my graduation. I got a long-term sub position that I started teaching math, high school math, the day after that. So very traditional kind of trajectory into the profession. And so, although it seems like inclusion and inclusive education for students labeled with disabilities in schools is still regarded as a newer thing, it was actually a focus of my teacher preparation in the late 1990s. And in the two high schools that I worked in as a special ed teacher, I was one of the first to work as a co-teacher in in-class support and in pull-out resource classes in one school. And then I also worked in a fully self-contained classes in another school. So in some ways, you could say I've worked as a teacher in nearly the full continuum of special education placements myself. And so I was a high school teacher in special ed for a while. Then I became initiated into the field of disability studies and education when I started my master's program in learning disabilities. And I took a class called Disability in Context. And in that class, it examined various perspectives on disability and the meanings of disability. And it really emphasized counter narratives of disability by highlighting people's lived experiences and the way that they talked about their experience of disability and disablement. And those stories especially challenged the medical model as a primary way that schools and education approached education for students labeled with disabilities. And that was really very powerful for me because, as I mentioned, I was working as a teacher at the same time in special education as I was learning all of these new perspectives or different perspectives than what I had learned. And so that was very powerful for me to be able to see those counter narratives also playing out in the lives of my students, also becoming much more critical of sort of the spaces that I was working in, and just gave me a new vocabulary and a great set of tools for my work as a teacher to align with students' hopes for themselves and to understand that really even the most well-meaning educators and educational practices can be sources of harm and trauma. And so I became so enthralled with these ways of thinking that I wanted to continue learning about disability studies. So shortly after, I started a doctoral program aiming to work with the same people who introduced me to those ideas. And so after taking classes part-time and continuing to teach full-time for a few years, I took a position at my grad school and a part-time leave of absence from teaching so I could actually finish the program, because as maybe some of you are working and going to school at the same time, it is not the easiest thing. So I was able to get a job at my university so that I was able to finish that out. And then from there, I got a full-time job as a teacher ed instructor at a different university, and I've been in university-based teacher education ever since. So even though I had actually thought for many years that I would return to high school, I actually almost quit my job a while back and was like, forget this, I just want to teach young people. But really, I've been in university-based teacher ed ever since. And as you might gather from how I've chosen to kind of talk about myself, although I have been about 20 years working in universities now, I do still very much try to do my work through the lens of a high school teacher. And pretty much all the courses that I teach now are in connection with K-12 schools and students. And I really do believe that learning how to be a teacher has to come from direct practice and experience with students in schools. And so, although you are familiar with my writing and things like that, I really put so much more of my effort into my teaching. It's really where my heart is. So that's what I can offer about how I started in education.
Yeah, so would you speak more about your experiences within these special education classes and how traditional models of special education schooling can perpetuate difference and reify the conception that there are normal versus abnormal ways of being? And how do you see this playing out in everyday schooling? And how are many current interventions functional or insufficient?
Sure. Thank you for that question. I could talk probably for 3 days about that, but I'm going to narrow it down by starting big in some ways. So I generally think of schools from a sociology perspective to consider the roles that education plays in society and the roles that schools play in their local communities. And why that connects to my experience is because in my teaching, I rarely had like a high school student be really upset about not learning particular parts of a curriculum, right? Or saying, oh, I'm not fast enough learning about whatever topics we're learning about. But what my students were intensely aware of was where they were in the school, who knew that they were in or not in special education. They were concerned about things like that, like what they could access or what they couldn't access, or what people thought of them in relation to where they were positioned in the school. And this is because in both the schools that I worked in, there were special ed rooms. And so if you were seen going into that room, there was meaning made of you. And I mean, this was a while ago, right? This is 20 years ago. So perhaps folks are kinder now. But I will say that I have a transcript, right, from a conversation that happened in a class 2 years ago. And it was students in general ed. And while they were being critical of the school practices, the way that they talked about students with disabilities was as the quote, life skills kids. And what that meant and what that tracked to, as later came out, was that that was like the name of the program in the school. And so that has always really stuck with me, right? In terms of, yes, we can think about the curriculum, we can think about the education, that's super important. However, I think what stands out to me is how students felt going through those spaces. And then the work that some of those folks then had to undo when they left school, because you have this identity that's been set as kind of an excluded identity. But then when you become part of a society, ideally you could become part of it, right? But I mean, there's a lot of work that people have to undo in terms of the harm that I think that schools have done because of that. And so I don't know if that is an attempt to answer at least part of that question. But going back to the bigger idea, so why do I think of schools from a sociology perspective? Is that I think of the roles that education in schools play. And unfortunately, I think some of that can be in marking people, right? In terms of like where they quote belong or don't belong in society. So if I build from that idea in terms of interventions and ideas that we're trying to make things better, let's hope, maybe, I don't know, hard to say in 2025. But I think building with that idea, if I start with the history of public education in the United States, we have to think about that version of schools, right? The Common School movement in like the 1830s, so 200 years ago at this point, they were either intentionally or de facto, right, as a fact of how they were really just created for the exclusion of everybody except for middle class white boys, right? That was sort of the advent of what became our public schooling system in the United States. And keeping in mind that wealthy children or children of wealthy families always had access, right, to prep schools before that. So schooling did exist, but it wasn't for everybody, right? It was for a very exclusive group of people. So I frame it like this because in the long view, right, it feels like 200 years was a really long time ago, but it wasn't in the scope of societal change. So I frame it like that because I think in a long view, in the fight for or about public education over the past, let's say, 100 years has really just been about trying to make this into a system that can be for everyone, but being in constant struggle between trying to hold on to things that don't really work when we're striving to include people into places and spaces that were built historically to exclude them, right? And so I think that is the struggle and why a lot of our current interventions, even over the past 100 years, aren't really that successful in making schools places where everyone can belong and feel comfortable and work toward whatever their best self is because that isn't what the blueprint of schools were. And I think we have yet to change that. And so what has happened with special education is that the systems and practices of special education were designed and imagined as necessarily being separate from education. So that was the first thing, was education for this small group of people. And then the second, third, fourth, fifth, sixth thing is that now we're going to open up education to other groups of people, but without really changing anything very much about that original sort of idea of what schools might look like or what function they might serve for society. So for special education and general education or regular education, I think we can see that separation and that sort of historical divide playing out in so many ways. It plays out in the existence of different teachers, different teacher certifications, designated schools, designated classrooms, designated spaces, different educational techniques, different funding sources, different materials marketed to schools, and so on the basis of like, these are things for regularly learning kids, and these are things for students with disabilities or in special education. Those separations are just so built into the fabric of what schools started as. And we, in some ways, we could say we made it worse by making a law in 1975. So that's only 50 years ago, that actually created special education as a whole separate entity that then gave rise to, again, different teacher certifications, different programs, different materials, like different professional societies. So that difference is so baked in, or at least treating those folks as different is so baked into so much. I think it's just really hard to undo that. But so I think a lot of our attempts to integrate education or to roll out various interventions fail because we actually don't agree on what our goals are for education as a society. So we don't really have any way of gauging what would be sufficient or insufficient, right, as to meeting a goal. So I know that's really cynical on a large scale, but as an example, if your goal is for every fourth grader to read the same, that's an unreasonable goal. Like that can't ever happen because people are simply different from each other. So a portion of the educational world, if that's what you think the goal of education is or what the goal of school is, that's always going to fail. And we're always going to try to find fault and blame to things that are almost always, we're going to blame everybody except for questioning the goal itself. And so I think that's the insufficiency I'd really like to name about curriculum in schools and interventions. If traditional models of education's drive is to make students do the same things in the same ways at the same times, then there's never going to be success because that just isn't how people work. So I think that the change from 100 years ago to now is that except for students with disabilities, we don't officially accept that young people have to be pushed out or kept out of schools. I think that these things were always here in education, but it used to be that we could push people out of school or hide them or, segregate in some ways so that the differences weren't visible. But now that we're trying not to do that as a society, right, the differences are very visible, but we're not blaming the initial idea of what we think schools should be. So I know that's a ranging and tricky answer, but I can't name it any other way as succinctly to say, stop thinking that all fourth graders have to read the same way. That's the insufficiency,
Yeah, that really resonated with me through reading your work, especially the example of the separation of students, how they viewed each other with the stairs, because that reminded me of how we used to, in our school, make fun of other students by saying, oh, you ride the short bus to school. And I think it's very difficult, like you said, to have these goals for students. Is that really where we should be going for every student? That being said, how does that affect the students in those classes with what they expect to be able to do or what they have come to expect to do? I remember you sharing in your work that some of the students had kind of become resigned to their position as being in the special education courses. So I want to hear more about that.
Yeah, in some of my experience, the conversations we had about students, it was like, we're just trying to get them through. Like, we're just trying to get them through this portion of their life so they can get out of school and get on with the rest of their life. And so I have very split feelings about that because, on the one hand, I was like, yes, everyone needs to have a diploma, regardless of this may be controversial, but you have to have one in order to get access even to the most basic employment. So I really think that having a high school diploma or a GED is just really an important piece of capital, right? That people really need to have to be able to make a life for themselves. So I respect that, but also there's a lot of low expectation in the idea of we're just trying to get them through, right? If we're just trying to get them through, then what are we really doing except for asking people to kind of mark time before they can get out to something else? So I don't know if I have a really satisfying answer to that as we kind of like look at what the world is as it is and what the world is as we wish it could be. And hopefully we can work towards something like in the middle of that or going to that. But I think the worst part about like self-contained special education is that we sometimes have low expectations for students, and we aren't even trying sometimes to figure out how to push further. It's like you're just here until you can get out into the quote real world, which is a phrase I hate because the real world is the world that we're living in no matter what it is, right? So I think there's the problem of low expectations that can happen sometimes in self-contained classes, but that also happens in lower tracked academic classes, right? So it's not just about students with disabilities. There's this idea that there's this potential and we should only be rigorous, let's say, with students who are getting good grades and moving fast, which I don't think is fair or accurate to how learning can work. So I think the low expectations and the way that schools kind of track that for people lead to lesser opportunities, lesser life chances. And I think that's a big problem. I think there's also an assumption that folks labeled with especially intellectual disabilities don't wish to pursue academic topics or learning. So there's this idea that because it's hard for someone, that means that they shouldn't do it, or they don't want to do it, or they don't want to struggle with that. And I also don't think that's true. I've founded at Montclair a program that is to bring college education, college learning experiences, but to open them up for students who have been labeled with intellectual disability. And I'll tell you that those students work hard and they're interested in being in college classes. Like they're not trying to, they're not trying to not learn. So I think that's the kind of faulty assumption that can happen with when we track people, right, into what we think is their potential or what we think are their interests. So, those are, I think, some of the negative side of what can happen in self-contained special ed or in lower track or in academic tracking altogether. But the tension is that because of the existence of special ed, right, and because of the existence of tracks, we haven't had to, as a system, really make regular curriculum make room for other ways to learn or other ways to express a desire to learn that isn't solely focused on speed of learning and competition based on age. So if it gets too hard for some students or for some teachers, we just move that kid to a different location in the school. We move them to a different academic track. We move them to special ed or something like that. And so what happens there is that quote unquote regular education isn't challenged to have to change. It doesn't have to change because instead of it changing, we are moving people out who we deem don't fit there. And so I think what we need to do is make regular education change so that it can be a suitable choice, let's say, for someone who does want to pursue academic curriculum. And then maybe we still have other spaces that people can choose into if they want. But right now, the choice isn't really there because it's like, in this room, we do this. In this room, we do this. In this room, we do this. Instead of it being a matter of, well, we know you want to be challenged in this room, but we're not willing to do that in this room. You're just going to have to go to that other place. Does that make sense? So I think the tension is resolvable, but we all have to challenge ourselves to do all those things better. We can make quote unquote special ed rooms more rigorous and have more opportunities and not assume that people don't want to learn because it's difficult for them. And we can make other regular education or other classes more open to people who need a different pace but still want that content. And I just don't think we're there yet. But I think we can get there.
I agree, and I see so many of those tensions. I substitute at a high school, and I work in a lot of their co-taught classrooms or special education classrooms. And what I've noticed in the special education classrooms, some of them, the expectations are just so incredibly low. And the teacher mindset is this one of they don't want to work, as you were saying. But then when these kids find something that they're really interested in or find a topic that matters a lot to them, they're willing to move mountains practically. And so a lot of changes to education, if they focused more on student autonomy, like what they are interested in, and finding ways to adapt the educational models, would really allow for them to participate in ways that haven't been fully imagined, but also invite them into these spaces that they're being excluded from. And so thinking about student autonomy and finding ways to have relationships and roles, whether that's in a school for younger kids or on a college level, what role do affinity spaces have in their lives?
Sure. So, affinity spaces are very important to disabled youth's development of positive disability identity for sure. And actually, I want to shout out, there's some people doing some awesome work on that from intersectional lenses. Carlin Mueller is a person who's doing a lot of work on that, and Sina Skelton is doing some cool work. But people are doing some really cool work on disability identity development, and affinity spaces are really important for that. And by that, I don't want to assume a definition, but the idea that people who have something in common, who have shared interests, who have a shared aspect, right, can come together in ways that are separating on purpose, right, to develop that sort of common sense of self or interest or whatever it may be. And so Crip Camp is an example of one thing that people might be looking at. And so when I think about Crip Camp, is that enabled the emergence of like collectivism and activism, right? Made possible of people coming together. And really that is capturing a time in history that was the first time that the idea that folks with disabilities shared an identity and shared a common experience was brought right to the forefront. I mean, that was the birth of disability culture, and that was the birth of disability rights. Because in terms of if you want to have a basis for claiming that people are deserving of rights, you've got to define who that group of people is, right? And so the work that we see in sort of the mid 20th century, I mean, that was the work of really people coming together and seeing that they could mount a fight because of a commonality that they had that prior to that wasn't always seen as a commonality, right? If we defined ourselves only by a medical diagnosis, that prevents us from feeling collectivism with other people who have different disabilities, but actually what that group did was they named what was the common sort of barrier to their participation in broader life chances and broader society. And that did, of course, exist. Like, I think the original disability related affinity space would probably be among capital D deaf folks. And those were brought together by American Sign Language and continue to be brought together largely by residential deaf schools. So that's an example where what we might say was segregated special education or segregated deaf education was the birth and continues to be a very important force for deaf culture. So I do think affinity spaces are really important. But a second piece of that is, so could self-contained special education be a place where folks can find that? And so Carla Mueller, who I mentioned before, has written about that and has said that there should be hope that this is the kind of work that teachers and students together who are together in special education spaces can be doing that kind of positive work. What her findings were, unfortunately, is that while there could be potential there, that isn't generally what's happening because medical definitions of disability and shame and exclusion just characterize those spaces in so many other ways. So I'm not sure what we do with that. But I do think, and I am seeing this, especially on college campuses, I do think that affinity spaces more likely can be found in student clubs, in places outside of classrooms that people are being brought together. So there are definitely liberatory disability spaces and neurodiversity spaces that are being formed from student created clubs. There's disability culture spaces that we can certainly find on college campuses. And actually many campuses, so here's another thing, right? So there's many campuses, right, that are developing disability cultural centers, like DCCs. And in some cases, those are intended specifically to be a counter space against disability resource centers where you go to get diagnosed and you get accommodations. And so some of those places have specifically tried to have separate spaces that are really about positive identity and not just about accommodations and diagnosis. So that's an interesting thing. But I have noticed that some campuses are just renaming their disability accommodation centers or resource centers to disability culture centers. And I think it's unclear at this time which of those are intending to build and create disability culture versus just a renaming of disability law kind of stuff. So that is yet to be seen. But I know on my campus, we have some lively disability centered clubs. We have some lively groups that don't actually call themselves that, but that is what the students know them to be. They are known to be safer spaces for that kind of gathering. So I do think that that's happening.
Yeah, I'm learning a lot here actually. And I think it is very inspiring to see a lot of people that are pushed to the margins coming together and trying to build their own spaces and their own culture. And I'm wondering, how should teachers interact with these cultures that are being built up? And, what does it look like when teachers teach toward care and inclusion in keeping these perspectives that have been built up, these identities? How should they interact with that in a way that honors and validates their experiences?
I think that we should recognize them, that we should validate them, that we should bring them into our practices. It's hard for me to answer that because I'm like, gosh, how could you not, right? How could you not see your students in front of you and ask them what they're doing and ask them what's important to them I would say that any teacher of any students should learn more about youth movements. They should learn about disability identity development as long as learning about development of all kinds of identities, and see that as something that is happening all the time, right through childhood and adolescence, especially in adolescence. So especially for any teacher of middle and high school students to be really attentive to making sure that you're making spaces where people can feel like they belong. And then recognizing, like, if we're doing collaborative group work in class or something like that, trying to help people build relationships and friendships, and maybe put people together and say, hey, I know that these two both have this in common, even though they have never interacted. So how can I facilitate that? If I'm a teacher or any other person in a school, how can I offer to be an advisor for a club? How can I help create that space, or things that I would recommend that we can do? But basically, we can always be, in most of the roles we have, not only teachers, students, but just in general, like any of you can be the person who starts the organization. AHEAD is the Association for Higher Education Disability, and they have an organization of student chapters called DREAM, DREAM. And so any one of you, right, can start a DREAM chapter and then welcome that on your campus or in schools. And so I think those are kinds of the things that I would say we can all see it as our responsibility to help people find themselves and find community that is going to be supportive for them.
One thing too that really stuck out to me in your work was your engagement with the idea of independence as a sort of interdependence, and how educators and students can work together to create this sociocultural shift that allows for us to have a practice of collective care versus this neoliberal individualized notion of the self that continues the conception that if you cannot care for yourself and are dependent, then you are insufficient or abnormal. And so I think engaging in this work on different levels is so important to activism in general and disability activism more specifically. And ableism has always been prevalent, as you were saying, like the history is not new. Yet we have had a troubling resurgence of eugenic thought attacking the rights of people with disabilities. And so what constraints are educators facing nowadays, and how can they resist and continue to practice care for their students with disabilities?
Yeah. I mean, this is a situation where I could ask it, well, gosh, which one are you talking about? Which one are you thinking about? We're in this very bizarro time. Like literally everything that I feel like I have tried to value and work toward in my profession, in my life, feels very much under attack. So in terms of specifically thinking about eugenics and around ideas of disability, what jumps to my mind is this resurgence of this dialogue that really is focused on autistic folks and characterizing them as like anything we can do to make sure your existence doesn't exist is what should happen. You know, every time we talk about we should get rid of this because it's a cause of autism, what we're saying is autistic folks shouldn't exist and we should do everything to make sure that they can't exist, and it's awful. And then within that too, right, we've got even divisions within the community because they're feeling resources are about to get really scarce. So it's like who's more deserving of support, and that's really hard too. And so I think that educators are facing constraints in terms of their speech. What can they say in class? Can they hang flags in class that honor students' identities without being targeted? I think that for teachers, there's always this weird sort of moral idea that they have to be paragons of virtue. That's like kind of an old-fashioned thing. But it leads to, if you're a teacher and you post something on social media against murderers, now all of a sudden you can get fired or something like that, right? That was hyperbolic. But so I think on some level, educators are sort of always on guard because they're often under the lens of attack for these things. So I think they have been feeling constrained for decades. I actually think that teachers have been under attack personally and professionally for decades, and that is wearing on the profession. And I think we're seeing that in things like teacher shortages and mass retirements. And I think that's coming from a lot of different places. But specifically, I think that how they can resist and continue to practice care for students with disabilities is by, for the most part, being the caring, supportive supportive people that they've been. Like being willing to have hard conversations when students bring them up or families bring them up, but also being a protective space, affirming, I am so glad you're here. I am so glad that you are who you are. I am so, you know what? I know that today's really hard and you're having a hard time like paying attention right now. So why don't you go take a walk? What would help you? Like, I think just counter narrating all of the ugliness, right, that's around is helpful. I think supporting parents, is helpful. The things that I think we would want to do in general as a society, help each other and care for each other, what we need to do to express that maybe more openly than we would, maybe typically, just to make it visible, to say, you might be hearing a lot of people who are saying things that are negative, but I want you to know that I'm glad you're here. Like, I think that can go a really long way. And I think sometimes teachers don't always think of students as people. Like, we don't always see young people as having full emotional lives, full lives. That idea of there's the real world in their school. But I think if we can understand that young people are experiencing the world just in the same way as other people, right? That can go a long way to just saying, I see you. I'm glad you're here.
When reading your work, Sue, I was touched by the way the students talk because it reminded me a lot of my brother who is on the spectrum. So I get to see some of the struggles he faces when a lot of the times for them, they just want to be listened to. They want their feelings validated. And when you were describing the kind of the need for an apparatus or like a multifaceted support system, right? Not just with education, but in other ways, right? So it reminded me a lot of mutual aid and some of the things that have been coming up recently. But it also reminded me of this artwork that was created by an artist named Louis Wayne. And your work made me think of it because it's a drawing of a anthropomorphized cat that's smiling, and underneath it says, I am happy because everyone loves me. And some of the history behind this piece is Louis Wayne struggled a lot with mental health. Some people said schizophrenia, but I've also seen people say maybe he was misdiagnosed. But this piece specifically, it was made when a lot of his supporters rallied together to move him to a better institution so he could be better supported. And he made this piece in response, right? I'm happy because everyone loves me. And I think that speaks to kind of like, right, everyone kind of needs a village to help them live but and also flourish. So yeah, I just wanted to share that because that's what I was thinking. Like this is kind of where I feel like we should move, right? Bringing back the village and making sure that everyone's validated and allowed to flourish.
Yeah, thanks for that. And I love this. I looked it up myself and now I'll include it in my stuff that I like to show other people. But I think that it's so basic, right? And so one of the things that I think about is like around disability, at least, is because of the systems, we've medicalized it so much that I think everyday people are afraid of interacting with disabled folks sometimes, right? It's like, I don't know what I'm doing. I'm not trained in this. I'm not certified to do this. When most things, so yes, there are some things that probably having more preparedness and experience with a person is important. However, most things that we experience in life, anybody can help us with. It's just a matter of people feeling, number one, like they can do it, and number two, like it's part of our responsibility to just be in the world with other people. And so I think that medicalization has kind of prevented that. The idea that I'm not an expert in disability, so I can't work with this person. I can't possibly know their need. When a need might just be like, I just need someone to open the door. Like it's not a big deal. Anybody could really do that. Or, this person just needs someone to move a pen in their field of writing. These aren't really technical things, but sometimes that can prevent it. So I really appreciate that. I do think that if we all see each other right, as worthy of help, as belonging. I think like that word is tricky sometimes, but I think that unfortunately schools and society have kind of been built up to be hyper individualistic, where if it doesn't fit, if it's disruptive, if it causes conflict, if it's slow, then pass it on, move it over. And if that's a human, so be it. You're moving too slow, move over. You're disrupting this order, move over. You're making me feel uncomfortable, move over, which is not the same as danger, right? Feeling uncomfortable is not the same as being actively in danger. But I also think we have mistaken those things at times where it's like, well, this is awkward and difficult, but I'm not really in danger. And so how do we accept that as a way of living and learning and say it's our job as a society to learn how to work and live together, but instead we've cast people out and said this is not our job to learn how to live and work with this person, which I don't want to be in extremes because certainly there are some situations where people really are in danger to themselves or others, but I do think that we are not always as thoughtful as we can be about defining danger from discomfort. And I think that we probably owe it to ourselves as a society to try to work a little more through discomfort to keep everyone feeling loved, right?
I really appreciate your framing of that in a way where you're focusing on these mutually affirming relationships where people, both sides of the coin, are taking from this and learning and finding community and care. One thing that Bosco and I had talked about before we met and everything was you had tackled the idea of the savior complex and how it's so dangerous and how you so often will see that in people interacting with people with disabilities and how that creates these unstable power dynamics and really doesn't get to the heart of finding community and focusing on people's true needs.
Yeah, and also it's hard. Like, I'm not going to pretend like I'm living this life. It's hard. So it's like the idea of production. So people have to produce in order to be a member. And I even think there's tension. Like, I agree with you. I want to say, everybody has needs and everybody gives things, right? Everybody contributes, everybody has needs. That's just bottom line. What we contribute and what we need are different things, but everybody does. But it's really hard in our current, or at least in the society that I live in, to not value things and people differently. And so I don't know. It's a work in progress. And like I said, I'm not going to pretend that I'm like living this life of complete mutual aid, but but I wish that it was easier to do so, right? I wish it was easier to do so.
As I was listening to the three of you chat, thought about how counter this is to dominant forms of education. You were just now speaking about slowness. There's a speed, and not just a speed, but a competitive speed to the way education has to happen, right? Oh, my child's so smart. They're ahead in reading, all the common things that you hear. But also, I was thinking a lot about, I think you think a lot, and I know you cite him, but you think a lot with Zusi Leonardo's work. I know that Leonardo talks about whiteness and smartness as property. And that's the dominant frame of education, that it's something that's held, that it's something that's capital. And as Sam suggested, at the best of times, it's this very neoliberal framework of pull yourselves up by the bootstraps, and anybody who can't do that is left out. At the worst of times, which I would argue we're in now, it's an active attack on anybody who's not doing that in an attempt to kind of expel them from educational worlds. But I wonder, it's like that phrase of it's easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism. I wonder, it's almost more difficult, even as somebody who takes up a lot of disability studies frameworks, it's almost more difficult for me to imagine a school that centers and is guided by the lives and the ideas of people with disabilities than it is to imagine. I can't imagine that kind of school. But yeah, as somebody, could you perhaps offer us a bit more hope?
So, look, these are puzzles that I don't have answers to, right? At all. And I have tried to imagine in all kinds of ways. And I think I have a tier system of like, here's what I can hope to happen in a traditional school. Here's what I can hope to happen if we were to create a school, right? A charter school, a private school, an independent thing. And then here's what I could imagine could happen. So I did some work, and I know you all experienced a discussion about punk and skateboard pedagogy, but through the ideas of unschooling, right? And so I have separated the ideas of learning from schooling. And I could even separate learning, schooling, and education as three different things. And so I think that's one way that I try to make sense of all the different things. And so when I think about education, I can think about learning and I can think about schooling, and I can think about how those things can happen together, but also how they happen separately or having nothing to do with each other. And I think that I want to imagine, can school, universities included, ever go back to being, if they ever were, maybe they weren't, or can they ever be delinked from employment and the market? And I don't see that, because I also am really a fan of people's voices and democracy being able to shape that. And no matter what I might imagine for youth, parents and communities want schools to lead to jobs, and they want them to lead to high paying and good jobs, whatever that might mean. And the punishment for not doing well in school is often you're going to be flipping burgers or whatever else, right? You're going to be working in food service or industries that aren't paying a lot. And I mean, that is the vision of school, right? Right now, it's like the reason why we need an education, and the reason why we go to school, or college for that matter, is to get that diploma, to get that degree, to get a job. And I don't know, right? Again, I don't want to be cynical, but I don't know how we find our way out of that. acceptance spaces that are just not school. And I don't know what to do with that. So I did spend some time in this, unschooling community. And most of my time there was most of the people in that space were actively deschooling, right? They had more than recently come from traumatic and traumatizing school experiences. And interestingly, although we didn't know this at the time, the group of us who were, hanging out in this community pretty quickly realized that the source of trauma and harm for most of the students who found themselves, leaving schools was about special ed and disability. And so that was an interesting thing. So anyway, why I say this in a long rambling way is that I spent a lot of time hanging out with those folks, and part of my intent in being there was to say, what can we learn from this deschooling, unschooling community and bring to make schools a little bit more open, a little bit more free, a little bit more focused on student agency and so on and so forth. Well, I'll tell you that in the end, I kind of thought they can't. They're not built to do that. And I don't know what to do with that. As long as a teacher is getting evaluated on their students' test scores, how do we do that? But I will say what we need to do is get rid of grades like A, B, C, D grades. And I say that because, so I have this program that is up and running for almost more than a decade now, where it's students who have been labeled with intellectual disabilities are able to come to college, they're able to audit courses and participate. And most of them have been in self-contained special ed in quote life skills classes for their entire high school careers. So coming to a college classroom is really not something they've experienced in very many ways. And in all of that time, we've had something like 200 students come through, take classes. I've never had a college professor email or say, this student doesn't belong here, or why is this student in my class? Never, not once. Whereas when I talk about inclusion for high schools or even middle schools, like high school and middle school teacher, they can't do this work. They don't belong here. So what on earth is going on there? And the thing that I can come up with is grades. So when we have students come to participate at Montclair in this program called the Increasing Access to College Project, the students aren't graded. They audit the courses. So they don't have to have a final grade, right? They just participate, they do whatever they're going to do, and then they move forward. And I really think this pressure of competition and grading and the idea that a grade has to mean something is one nameable problem that prevents all else from falling into place. So smaller class sizes, get rid of grades. That's my solution for solving the ills of education.
Thank you so much for this insightful work. I found something very interesting to me is that the idea of care, when you were talking about that care should not be related about feelings of pity or feeling sorry for disabled students, but it should be like shared and based on fairness and respect. And like care, real care means that we should work together and like including teachers, students, families, parents, and communities to make the education like journey accessible for everyone, and that care becomes a way of challenging the unfair systems, not just like helping individuals. One more thing that I liked is when you talked about the teacher's role and that teachers need to question their own like assumptions about normal teachers, and instead of trying to make the students' life fit the lesson, teachers should ask how the lesson can fit all students and how this requires flexibility, creativity, and willingness to learn from the disabled students themselves. And actually, one thing that I also liked, like when you were talking about the importance of grades, I come from a background like I am Palestinian and I like studied like I spent my whole life in Gaza, and my educational experience is completely different than here. Like when we were students there, the only thing that mattered to us is grades, and the whole education system depended on memorization and like how much you learn and on spoon feeding. But I really like the suggestions and like the changes that I found here. And I was telling Dr. Jordan that I hope that one day all of these educational systems change for the better. So thank you so much for everything. That was really very insightful meeting with you.
Today's episode was produced by all of us in the Education, Genocide, Liberation class. If you like our podcast, please like, rate, subscribe, comment, give us 5 stars. You can also find us on social media. We're on Instagram as Another Ed is Possible. Thanks as always for listening. We'll be back soon with a new episode of Another Education is Possible.